In this video, I'll introduce what is theory. This has been a long-standing question since the beginning of the history of philosophy of science. In the field of educational leadership, if you ask this question around, you may receive very different, confusing answers. Some scholars use many terms interchangeably, including theory, concept, construct, theoretical, conceptual, theorize, and conceptualize. Other scholars believe that nuances exist to differentiate those terms. Take a look at this sentence from a recently published article in Educational Administration Quarterly. All functions of leadership must stem conceptually, theoretically, and practically from our understanding of the principles of learning. The use of conceptually and theoretically in one sentence implied that authors attached different meanings to conceptually and theoretically. However, the authors stopped there without explaining how they differentiated conceptually and theoretically. Scholars often assume that what theory means is self-explanatory to readers. That assumption is unfounded if you look around confusing scholars who wrestle with developing a theoretical framework. What theory means can vary from one author to another. If you look it up in a dictionary, you will find many definitions. They include a plausible or scientifically acceptable general principle or body of principles offered to explain phenomena, a hypothesis assumed for the sake of argument or investigation, an unapproved assumption, the general or abstract principles of a body of fact, abstract thought, and the analysis of a set of facts in their relation to one another. Tracking the origin of the word theory, you find that the word came from Greek, which means contemplation and speculation. Early use of the word theory can be found in music theory in 1610, which was about principles of musical composition. After 400 years, the use of theory has been so confusing that it sometimes becomes meaningless. In his book on theoretical sociology, Robert Merton wrote, "Like so many words that are bandied about, the word theory threatens to become meaningless because its references are so diverse, including everything from minor working hypotheses through comprehensive but vague and unordered speculations to axiomatic systems of thought. Use of the word often obscures rather than creates understanding." In my book, Demystify Theories, I introduced two major definitions of theory in educational leadership research: explanation of a phenomenon and logical propositions. The first definition of theory is an explanation of a phenomenon. A theory can be defined as an explanation of a particular social phenomenon. How do you study leadership? You start with what leadership is. When we say that we have a theory about leadership, what we mean is that we can offer an explanation of leadership. This explanation should identify a number of factors, dimensions, facets, components, elements, or conditions. Many theories about leadership styles fall into this category of definition. In this line of explanation, leadership can be explained by leader behavior. A pattern of leader behavior is then considered as a leadership style. For example, the theory of transformational leadership presents an explanation of leadership, and this explanation describes a pattern of leader behavior that has 5 factors. First, Idealized influence attributed, which refers to the socialized charisma of the leader, whether the leader is perceived as being confident and powerful, and whether the leader is viewed as focusing on higher order ideals and ethics. Second, idealized influence behavior. This refers to charismatic actions of the leader that are centered on values, beliefs, and a sense of mission. Third, inspirational motivation. It refers to the ways leaders energize their followers by viewing the future with optimism, stressing ambitious goals, projecting an idealized vision, and communicating to followers that the vision is achievable. Fourth, intellectual stimulation, which refers to leaders' actions that appeal to followers' sense of logic and analysis by challenging followers to think critically and find solutions to difficult problems. And fifth, individualized consideration, which refers to leader behavior that contributes to follower satisfaction by advising, supporting, and paying attention to the individual needs of followers, and thereby allowing them to develop and self actualize. This definition of transformational leadership, along with its measure of multi-factor leadership questionnaire, has been widely used in leadership research. But this is not the only definition of transformational leadership. Moreover, transformational leadership is one of many explanations of leadership. Scholars have proposed countless leadership styles, such as authentic leadership, caring leadership, charismatic leadership, collective leadership, collaborative leadership, crisis leadership, culturally responsive school leadership, democratic leadership, destructive leadership, distributed leadership, ethical leadership, instructional leadership, shared leadership, servant leadership, social identity leadership, social justice leadership, spiritual leadership, strategic leadership, teacher leadership, leadership for learning, toxic leadership, trade theory of leadership, and transactional leadership. Even so, you may still find some behavior that does not fit the rigid categorizations of leadership styles. Another example of a theory as an explanation that identifies a number of factors or conditions is organizational justice. Organizational justice has four factors. The first factor is distributive justice, which is fair allocation of resources. The second factor of organizational justice is procedural justice, which means applying procedures consistently across people and across time, collecting and using accurate information to make decisions, having mechanisms to correct flawed or inaccurate decisions, conforming to personal or prevailing standards of ethics or morality, and making sure that opinions of various groups affected by the decisions have been taken into consideration. The third factor of organizational justice is interactional justice, which means treating people with politeness, dignity, and respect. The fourth factor of organizational justice is informational justice, which means providing people with explanations that convey information about why procedures are used in a certain way or why outcomes are distributed in a certain manner. Here is one more example. Ethical leadership can be explained by leader behavior in three dimensions. First, fairness. It refers to acting with integrity and treating others fairly, making principled and fair choices, being trustworthy and honest, not practicing favoritism, and taking responsibility for their own actions. The second dimension of ethical leadership is power sharing. It means allowing subordinates a say in decision making and listening to their ideas and concerns. Third, role clarification. It means clarifying responsibilities, expectations, and performance goals so that subordinates know what is expected from them and understand when their performance meets the expectation. Again, there is no agreed-on definition of a theory. The definition of ethical leadership was later expanded from 3 dimensions to 7 dimensions. In addition to fairness, power sharing, and role clarification, scholars included 4 more dimensions. People orientation means genuinely caring about, respecting, and supporting subordinates, and where possible, ensuring that their needs are met. Integrity means consistency of words and acts and keeping promises. Ethical guidance means communication about ethics, explanation of ethical rules, and promotion and reward of ethical conduct among subordinates. Concerns for sustainability means caring about the environment. In educational leadership literature, ethical leadership was defined as the difference between normative rationality and technical rationality, and how the two rationalities are managed both within and outside the leader. You can find many more definitions of ethical leadership in the literature of educational leadership. How do you define ethical leadership? With different theoretical lenses, you explain leadership differently. You can explain leadership from a transformational leadership perspective. You can also explain leadership from a perspective of organizational justice. You can do the same from the perspective of ethical leadership. Like wearing glasses, you look at and explain leadership differently through different theoretical lenses. The second definition of theory is much more stringent than the first definition that focuses on identifying factors or conditions. Here, theory is defined as logical propositions that establish testable hypotheses about relationships among constructs. If we follow this definition, a theory has 2 elements: constructs and assumptions of construct relationships. Theories provide answers to the what, which refers to constructs that are building blocks of a theory, such as fairness, power sharing, and role clarification. Theories also provide answers to how, which means how constructs are related to one another. Theories also provide answers to why, which means causal mechanisms that explain the construct relationships. In this case, theory has other names that bear similar meaning, such as model, theorem, law, rule, principle, and framework. Theoretical constructs are necessary but not sufficient for theory. Let's first look at constructs. A construct refers to a particular meaning that has been attached. To understand something, we have to start somewhere by describing and labeling it. For example, ethnicity is a biological construct, but race is a social construct. Social capital is a construct, meaning the sum of resources to which an individual or a group can access. But attaching the meaning to social capital is only the first step to developing a theory to explain social capital. You still need to propose some relationships to explain how social capital is generated. One example of proposing construct relationships is Ronald Byrd's social capital of structural wholes. To build social capital, according to Byrd, it is not sufficient to simply build a large number of social ties. Rather, it is uniquely advantageous to build a specific type of ties, the ties that function as a bridge connecting structural wholes. First, what are structural wholes? Structural wholes are gaps or empty spaces between clusters in networks. Here, I point out two structural holes in the network you see on the screen. There are many structural holes in this network. The cluster on either side of the structural holes are aware of each other. They're just so preoccupied with their activities within their own clusters that they don't have the mental capacity to attend to the activities in another cluster. You can also consider those structural holes as buffers or insulators. Imagine that each node represents an individual. If two people have access to each other's resources, then there is a tie connecting them. Both Abby and Brian have 4 social ties, but they don't have the same amount of social capital. There is no structural hole in Abby's social network because everyone in Abby's social network is connected to one another. By contrast, each of the 4 Brian's ties functions as a bridge to a different pool of resources. The ties between Brian and individuals 2, 5, 6, and 8 enable Brian to access resources in group A, B, C, and D, respectively. In Bird's theory of social capital, there are multiple constructs: social ties, structural holes, and social capital. Those constructs all have particular meanings. Moreover, Bird's theory explains how those constructs relate to one another to generate social capital. It is not just the number of social ties that create social capital. It is also about whether those social ties connect a structural whole in a way that bridges resources embedded in different social groups. Bird's theory established the relationship between social capital and structural holes. If you use Bird's theory to explain an individual's social capital, you not only count how many social ties each individual has, but also examine structural holes in a social network. Abby and Brian have the same number of social ties, but Brian has more social capital than Abby because Brian's social network has more structural holes than Abby's. Following the stringent definition of theory that requires logical propositions, you may find most of the so-called theories in educational leadership are only constructs. In this sense, much of the research in educational leadership is better labeled theoretically oriented than theory. In my book on how to develop a theoretical framework, I adopt the stringent definition of theory. A theory is comprised of constructs and relationships among the constructs. According to this definition, constructs alone are not a theory. They are building blocks of a theory. A good theory is not a list of constructs or the addition of a new variable to an existing list. A pile of stones is not a house. Likewise, a pile of constructs does not constitute a theory. A good theory constitutes description and explanation, a plausible, cogent explanation for why we should expect certain relationships in our data. Needless to say, the definitions of theory have been quite confusing to many educational leadership researchers and practitioners. In my book, a theory explains essential elements of what, how, and why. Following this definition, you find that the field of educational leadership is overflowing with constructs, but not theories. To further understand what theory is, please check out my next video on what theory is not.